They were never supposed to be seen. Not like this. The cameras of 1859 caught something the world wasn't ready to witness. 17 masters, powerful men, their eyes sewn open, their tongues cut, lying like grotesque statues of punishment. And in the background, silent, almost invisible, yet unshakably present, a young slave girl smiled. That smile wasn't innocence. It was knowledge. It was awareness of secrets so dark, so forbidden, that centuries later, we still struggle to comprehend them. This was not mere vengeance. It was a system speaking in symbols, a message coded in the bodies of men who had thought themselves untouchable. To understand this, you must step inside the world that created it, a society built on oppression, where power was absolute, cruelty normalized, and obedience demanded without question. And yet, beneath the polished veneer of civility, hidden currents of fear, suppression, and psychological control flowed like poisoned rivers, invisible to the untrained eye but lethal to anyone who underestimated them. The photograph itself was a betrayal, a snapshot frozen in time, capturing horror and paradox, showing the consequences of actions most thought would go unpunished. And the girl, her gaze, her smile, was the pivot of it all. It is in her expression that the hidden knowledge resides, the awareness that systems of power, no matter how absolute, are always vulnerable, always under surveillance by forces the powerful ignore or suppress. She understood what the men could not. Cruelty leaves fingerprints, and memory preserves what justice fails to deliver. What you are about to hear is dangerous knowledge. These are not stories designed for comfort. They are blueprints of human behavior, archives of psychological manipulation, and lessons in how power corrupts, controls, and ultimately collapses under the weight of inevitability. You are being invited into a world you were never meant to see. This is the doorway to forbidden history, to suppressed truths, to the mechanics of human evil that operate quietly behind the facades of civilization. Pay attention. Every detail matters. Every expression, every arrangement of bodies, every artifact of cruelty tells a story. And the girl's smile. That is your signal. It is the quiet insistence that awareness, patience, and observation are more powerful than fear, that memory is more potent than obedience, and that the inevitability of reckoning lies waiting for those willing to witness it. Tonight, you will see what most are blind to, and once seen, your perception will never be the same. What you are seeing is not an isolated act of vengeance. It is the echo of systems long perfected, of institutions designed to manipulate, dominate, and erase memory. The 17 masters, mutilated yet frozen in a courtroom photograph, are evidence not just of personal reckoning, but of the hidden rules that govern human behavior when power is unchecked. Every sewn eye, every cut tongue, is a symbol of suppressed voices, of authority stripped to its bones, revealing the fragility beneath the veneer of control. The slave girl's smile is the true enigma. It is a map of awareness. She had lived within structures designed to erase identity, to convert fear into obedience, and to silence insight. And yet, in that smile, she carried the knowledge that what is hidden always finds a way to surface. Power, when reliant on terror, leaves patterns. Authority, when built on suppression, leaves traces. And those who survive, who observe, who remember, acquire a currency no master can seize: understanding. Consider the psychological architecture here. Cruelty was systematized. Fear was administered with precision. Whispers became instruments of control. The girl's world was one where even fleeting resistance invited annihilation. And yet, the photograph captures a subtle but undeniable truth. The mechanics of terror are never infallible. Those who endure them can perceive the invisible currents of manipulation, the blind spots of authority, and the inevitable cracks in the armor of tyranny. Observation becomes survival. Memory becomes strategy. This is where most fail to see the danger and the power. People assume systems of cruelty are eternal because the outward appearance is polished, because the social rituals conceal the horror, because the victims are silenced. But every structure depends on perception and obedience. Remove one, and the illusion collapses. The girl's smile is the signal of awakening, the recognition that no matter how absolute the terror seems, the mind capable of observing it, cataloging it, and transforming it into knowledge holds power the oppressors cannot anticipate. Tonight, as you absorb this, understand the implication. You are not simply watching history. You are witnessing the anatomy of control, the blueprint of fear, and the seeds of inevitability. Every sewn eye, every mutilated tongue, every faintly smiling witness carries a lesson. Cruelty may dominate, but memory endures. Suppression leaves fingerprints, and those who observe with patience, who endure with awareness, will always have the ability to wield the unspoken power hidden in plain sight. To understand why 17 men could end up mutilated in a courtroom, and why a young slave girl could smile in their presence, you must first see the system that made it possible. This was not chaos. This was architecture. Cruelty was engineered, normalized, and institutionalized over generations. From the plantations to the courts, from private homes to public policy, society had designed mechanisms to suppress truth, erase memory, and maintain obedience. Every ritual of fear, every act of intimidation, was part of a larger machine that few understood and fewer questioned. The psychological manipulation was subtle, almost invisible. Children were trained in obedience, adults in fear. The narrative of civility masked horrors. Whispers replaced truth. Authority demanded compliance, not understanding. Those who questioned were erased or made invisible. In such an environment, cruelty could become ritualized, even banal, and the perpetrators, like the 17 masters, could believe themselves untouchable. The system rewarded arrogance and punished empathy, creating a cycle where oppression fed itself and silence became survival. But systems, no matter how well engineered, always leave cracks. Fear relies on perception. Obedience depends on ignorance. Control can persist only while the mechanisms of power remain unseen, unquestioned, and uncontested. And somewhere in that network of oppression, someone observes, someone remembers, someone transforms suffering into awareness. The girl's smile was the signal of such awareness. She had seen the patterns, catalogued the injustices, and recognized the fragility of authority. She understood that power built on terror was temporary, and that every system carries the seeds of its own collapse. This is the lesson hidden in plain sight. Institutions, hierarchies, and social orders can manipulate behavior and suppress truth, but they are never absolute. Observers who endure, who study patterns, who internalize trauma and memory, acquire an understanding of the architecture that the oppressors never anticipate. In this moment, a slave girl, not armed with wealth, not wielding influence, possessed a clarity that exceeded that of the men before her. Her smile was both defiance and comprehension, a recognition that history remembers, even when society forgets. And for you, the viewer, the warning is immediate. Hidden systems exist everywhere. They rely on perception, fear, and suppression. But to see them, to catalog the patterns, to understand the mechanisms of manipulation, is to acquire a weapon no institution can disarm. This is forbidden knowledge, dangerous knowledge, the kind that changes the way a man sees power, control, and inevitability. Once you see it, you can no longer ignore it. You are being prepared to observe, to endure, and ultimately to awaken. Power, when unchallenged, becomes a toxin. The 17 masters had believed themselves untouchable because they operated within systems designed to protect and exalt them. Authority, privilege, and wealth insulated them from consequence. They saw themselves as apex figures, immune to the very consequences that their own cruelty had sown. And yet, this arrogance blinded them. Systems of oppression feed on compliance, but they crumble under observation, patience, and inevitability. The more absolute their control, the more predictable their downfall. The psychology of the oppressors is a study in self-deception. They justify cruelty as order, punish rebellion as necessity, and silence dissent as preservation of hierarchy. Every act of violence, every ritual of intimidation, is rationalized, codified, and normalized. But this very rationalization becomes their weakness. They fail to anticipate awareness beyond fear. They fail to perceive the silent observers cataloging patterns, learning strategies, and internalizing every crack in their authority. And it is in these blind spots that inevitability grows. The girl understood this instinctively. While the masters relied on intimidation and ritual, she relied on observation and patience. She had no authority, no weapon beyond memory and insight, but that was enough. Cruelty, meticulously executed, had left patterns. Control, rigid and systemic, had created vulnerabilities. She had witnessed the architecture of their behavior, the rituals of domination, and the predictable lapses that human arrogance always produces. And in the courtroom photograph, the culmination of this understanding was clear. The oppressors were exposed, powerless against a force they could not calculate. This is the deeper lesson hidden in history. Power is never absolute. Authority built solely on fear, obedience, and suppression is fragile. The more brutal the system, the more predictable it becomes to someone who studies its patterns. Trauma, when internalized and analyzed, transforms into knowledge. Knowledge, when applied with patience and precision, becomes inevitability. And inevitability is a force the oppressors cannot defend against, no matter how untouchable they believe themselves to be. For the observer, the implication is profound. You are being shown the anatomy of control, the way systems manipulate, punish, and hide their weaknesses. The masters fell not because they were weak, but because they relied on predictability, arrogance, and silence. Those who endure, who watch, and who internalize the hidden rules of power gain access to a force more potent than intimidation, clarity. And clarity, once grasped, can alter the balance of control forever. Horror thrives when institutions protect it. The 17 masters had built their dominance atop layers of complicity, each reinforced by laws, traditions, and social norms that ignored suffering and rewarded obedience. Courts, clergy, neighbors, and officials all played roles, silent, deliberate, or willfully ignorant, in sustaining a system where cruelty became invisible, acceptable, even untouchable. The architecture of corruption was subtle, disguised by ceremony and hierarchy, yet precise in its purpose: maintain order through fear and suppress any threat to authority. The mechanics of this corruption were psychological as much as structural. Fear became a currency. Silence was a contract. Witnesses learned quickly that truth carried a price, often unbearable. And in such a climate, atrocities could continue unchecked because the system itself created a cocoon around the oppressors. These mechanisms were not accidental, they were intentional, crafted over decades to normalize cruelty, to codify obedience, and to hide the consequences of excess. Every law, every tradition, every ritual served a purpose beyond civility. It maintained control. Yet even the most airtight system contains blind spots. The girl, whose gaze held knowledge that would outlast fear, was one of those blind spots. She observed, catalogued, and remembered. She understood that while laws and institutions can shield perpetrators from immediate consequences, they cannot erase patterns. They cannot suppress inevitability. Every act of cruelty, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves marks on behavior, on psychology, on society itself. And those marks, when studied with precision and patience, reveal weakness. This is the dangerous lesson the photograph conceals. The system that allowed the masters to act with impunity is not infallible. Power relies on perception, on silence, on fear. Once those elements are disrupted by awareness, the balance shifts. The girl's silent comprehension became a vector for eventual reckoning. She did not act violently, not yet, but her observation, her knowledge, and her patient endurance laid the foundation for the inevitable exposure of cruelty. And here's the principle you must internalize. Systems of oppression, no matter how institutionalized, carry vulnerabilities invisible to those who wield power without scrutiny. Awareness of these patterns is dangerous knowledge. Memory becomes strategy. Observation becomes leverage. And those who survive, who study, and who understand these hidden frameworks gain power the oppressors cannot anticipate. The photograph is more than history. It is instruction, a blueprint for seeing beneath the surface of authority, control, and cruelty. The machinery of fear does not rely solely on punishment. It thrives on obedience cultivated from birth, on the subtle shaping of thought, perception, and expectation. The victims of this system were trained to anticipate cruelty before it struck, to internalize control, to obey without question. Fear became reflex. Silence became instinct. Every glance, every whisper, every ritual of punishment reinforced the message: deviation is annihilation. And in this crucible, the human mind learns to suppress insight, to doubt perception, to defer to authority. Yet suppression is never perfect. Even within the most rigid system, awareness can survive in fragments, small observations that escape control, small patterns that reveal hidden rules. The girl's smile in the courtroom photograph is proof. She had absorbed every ritual, every act of terror, and yet retained the ability to see through the architecture of control. She had catalogued cruelty without being consumed by it, transformed fear into comprehension, and prepared herself for a world where knowledge of patterns is the only armor that matters. Psychological control relies on invisibility. The masters understood that fear, amplified by ritual, creates obedience. But they underestimated the resilience of observation, the subtle power of memory, and the inevitability of comprehension. Every scream they suppressed, every injustice they normalized, became data, fuel for understanding the architecture that held them aloft. To those trained in observation, cruelty becomes predictable. Power built on terror reveals its own blind spots. And those who endure long enough, and observe sharply enough, learn that obedience is a choice forced only by ignorance. This is where the real danger lies. Most people, when faced with cruelty, respond instinctively. Submission, fear, avoidance. Rarely do they see the system behind it. Rarely do they understand that the machinery of control leaves patterns in plain sight. But the girl did. Her awareness was a quiet defiance, invisible to the masters, yet infinitely more dangerous than open rebellion. Because knowledge of the system allows one to predict, endure, and, ultimately, transform oppression into leverage. For the viewer, the lesson is immediate. Psychological control is everywhere, in institutions, relationships, and social hierarchies. To survive, to awaken, and to master, one must learn to see what others cannot. The architecture of fear, the patterns of obedience, the vulnerabilities hidden in plain sight. Awareness becomes a weapon. Observation becomes strategy. And inevitability, once understood, cannot be resisted. Ritual is the most insidious form of control. The masters did not merely punish, they staged obedience as theater. Daily routines, choreographed punishments, ceremonial gestures of authority, all designed to normalize terror, to enforce hierarchy, and to render compliance instinctive. Every command, every glance, every enforced posture carried a message. You exist only through my permission. Your life, your body, your mind, belong to me. The victims absorbed these signals, embedding them deep within their psyche, while outwardly performing the obedience demanded. Yet even the most meticulous rituals create patterns. Every repetition, every predictable response, every enforced posture of subjugation becomes a blueprint for understanding the machinery of control. The girl, witnessing it all, catalogued these behaviors with precision. She observed the timing of punishments, the triggers of anger, the subtle shifts in authority, and the weaknesses in attention and patience. In a system designed to erase identity, she preserved it through observation, understanding that survival is not merely compliance, it is comprehension. The masters believed that control was absolute because fear seemed unbroken. But fear, when studied, reveals vulnerability. Repetition, while reinforcing obedience, also exposes predictability. Cruelty, while terrifying, leaves fingerprints. The young girl understood that patterns within terror were maps, and maps guide action. Observation transforms the passive into power, memory into inevitability. The ritualized oppression that had enslaved bodies could not enslave understanding, and it is in this overlooked truth that real power quietly grows. Here lies a subtle but critical lesson. Systems that thrive on routine and predictability are vulnerable to anyone who watches long enough, who observes carefully, and who retains memory when others forget. The photograph, capturing 17 mutilated masters and a smiling witness, is a testament to this principle. The girl had absorbed years of orchestrated terror, and yet her mind remained unbroken. Her knowledge turned what seemed invincible into something fragile, and her awareness, silent, unseen, patient, became a weapon more powerful than any physical force. To you, the observer of this story, the implication is clear. Every hierarchy, every institution, every system that enforces compliance leaves patterns. Those who endure and watch, who internalize without being crushed, gain the ability to anticipate, navigate, and ultimately transform the architecture of control. Rituals of oppression, no matter how elaborate, are vulnerable to patience, awareness, and comprehension. And once you understand this, you can no longer see the world the same way. You begin to perceive the invisible currents that govern power, and you learn the first rule of forbidden knowledge. The system is never stronger than the mind that observes it. Defiance rarely arrives with a roar. Often, it begins as a flicker, a moment of awareness that the system is not invincible, a subtle shift in perception that the masters cannot see. For the young girl, that flicker emerged in the smallest of acts, a glance unbroken, a hesitation in compliance, a smile in the courtroom photograph. It was not rebellion in the physical sense. It was a mental refusal to surrender completely, a silent assertion that her mind remained untouchable even as her body obeyed. This is where the real danger to authority arises. Systems of control rely on submission, not just of the body, but of the will. The moment awareness flickers, compliance becomes imperfect, predictable mistakes appear, and the illusion of omnipotence begins to crack. The masters, oblivious to the quiet defiance growing in the girl, continued their rituals, confident in their absolute power. They did not perceive that she was studying them, learning their habits, and memorizing patterns that would one day become instruments of reckoning. Every gesture of control, every enforced posture, every ritualized act of cruelty became a lesson. The girl catalogued them silently, imprinting each pattern into memory. She watched how anger was triggered, how fear was distributed, and how obedience could be manufactured through repetition. Knowledge accumulated in the mind is invisible yet potent. Unlike physical resistance, which can be crushed, mental defiance survives, grows, and eventually translates into a force the oppressors cannot anticipate. The photograph captures the tension perfectly. 17 masters, victims of their own arrogance, subjected to the consequences of systems they never considered might be turned against them, and a girl, seemingly inconsequential, smiling not out of joy, but out of comprehension. She is the embodiment of patient inevitability, the observer who absorbs cruelty and transforms it into understanding. Her mind is free in a world designed to enslave it, and that freedom is more dangerous than any weapon the masters could possess. For the viewer, this moment is instructive. Resistance is not always loud or violent. Often, it is the patient collection of data, the quiet observation, the internalization of patterns, and the cultivation of insight. Awareness itself is defiance. Memory itself is power. And those who endure and understand, who recognize the cracks in the architecture of control, become unstoppable, not because they are stronger physically, but because they have seen the invisible currents that the powerful rely on to survive. The girl's subtle defiance is your first lesson in forbidden awareness. Observation changes everything. Power is never absolute. It exists only within the networks that support it. The 17 masters were insulated not solely by their wealth or social standing, but by a lattice of institutional complicity. Courts that turned blind eyes, officials who ignored abuses, neighbors who whispered but never acted. All of them contributed to the illusion that cruelty could persist without consequence. Every layer of authority, every sanctioned silence, every ritual of obedience reinforced the master's belief in invulnerability. They were untouchable, or so they thought. But the very systems designed to protect them contained vulnerabilities. Bureaucracies rely on predictability, hierarchies depend on fear, and social compliance requires ignorance. When awareness emerges within that network, the armor of authority begins to crack. The girl understood this instinctively. She observed not only the masters but the lattice surrounding them, the enablers, the witnesses, the silent accomplices. Every gesture, every hesitation, every overlooked detail became data. Knowledge of the network is as potent as any weapon. Institutional complicity is the quiet architect of oppression. Laws, traditions, and protocols can all be twisted to maintain cruelty under the guise of order. Yet even within these mechanisms, human error, arrogance, and blind trust create openings. The masters assumed absolute control because the network around them was predictable and obedient. But awareness, quiet, patient, unseen, turns predictability into vulnerability. Observers who understand the architecture of authority gain the ability to anticipate its failures and exploit its blind spots. This is why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. Seeing how the system protects cruelty, how obedience is manufactured, and how hierarchy conceals weakness gives you insight no authority wants you to possess. The girl's smile in the courtroom photograph was not merely expression. It was a recognition of these vulnerabilities. She understood that power depends on perception, and that those who manipulate perception can be unmasked, outmaneuvered, and ultimately dismantled by someone who has studied the architecture of control. For you, the viewer, the lesson is clear and irreversible. Institutions are not invincible. Hierarchies are not eternal. Authority relies on complicity and perception, and awareness, patient, careful, relentless awareness, is the first step in dismantling it. Observation transforms fear into insight. Memory transforms suppression into strategy. And inevitability emerges for those who endure, who watch, and who understand. The system that once seemed untouchable is never stronger than the mind that sees through it. Rebellion is rarely loud. Often, it travels in whispers, in gestures, in coded glances and half-hidden messages. Within the oppressive architecture surrounding the 17 Masters, knowledge circulated quietly, invisibly, among those who were watched but never fully understood. Every servant, every child, every enslaved individual who endured cruelty developed a silent language, a network of observation, memory, and subtle defiance that the Masters could not anticipate. This invisible communication is as powerful as any weapon. While the oppressors relied on fear to enforce obedience, the oppressed relied on awareness to preserve identity, insight, and eventual strategy. The girl, whose smile became immortalized in the courtroom photograph, was part of this network. She observed patterns, documented behaviors mentally, and transmitted knowledge through subtle actions, gestures, and expressions. Even the most meticulous rituals of control left cracks, and through those cracks, understanding spread. The power of unspoken rebellion lies in its invisibility. The Masters could punish the body, but they could not suppress the mind. They could enforce ritual and obedience, but they could not erase awareness. Every subtle act of communication, the flicker of a glance, the pause in routine, the shift in posture, became a thread in a web of understanding that quietly undermined authority. Awareness, patient and precise, became a form of resistance the oppressors could not measure or contain. The photograph captures the culmination of this silent force. 17 Masters, powerless before the eventual reckoning, and a girl whose comprehension had grown over years of observation, whose mind had catalogued cruelty and control, whose presence alone represented an invisible defiance. Her smile was a transmission of knowledge, a signal to all who saw it that awareness persists, that observation survives, and that inevitability grows in silence before striking. For the viewer, the lesson is immediate. Power is vulnerable not just to confrontation, but to observation, to patient understanding, and to unspoken networks of awareness. Those who endure, who witness, who internalize patterns of control without being broken, possess an intelligence and inevitability far beyond physical strength. Every system, no matter how rigid, contains cracks that only patience and observation can reveal. Knowledge can be transmitted silently, and once understood, it becomes unstoppable. Awareness is rebellion, memory is strategy, and inevitability is the force that follows. Arrogance is the silent architect of collapse. The 17 Masters, convinced of their invincibility, continued their rituals of fear, enforcing obedience with precision and assuming that no one could see the patterns behind their cruelty. Yet predictability is the enemy of power. Every repeated gesture, every ritualized act, every abuse of authority created a blueprint, a roadmap for understanding, memoized by those who survived, observed, and endured. What the Masters thought was strength was, in truth, fragility. The first signs of their unraveling were subtle, almost imperceptible. Hesitations appeared in the ranks of those who obeyed, minor mistakes in execution of their routines, and cracks in the perfection of their authority. They could not perceive that every action they took was being catalogued, that every signal of fear they produced was being transformed into comprehension by eyes they thought unseen. The girl, along with the network of observant survivors, had converted suppression into insight. And insight, once precise, is the precursor to inevitability. Psychology reveals the pattern. Humans who wield power through fear often underestimate the endurance of memory. They mistake submission for ignorance, silence for compliance, and ritualized terror for control. But every act of cruelty leaves a trace. Every act of manipulation becomes predictable to someone willing to endure and observe. And the girl, invisible in plain sight, had transformed trauma into awareness, fear into understanding, and observation into latent power. The photograph, frozen in time, captures the apex of this moment. 17 men, confident and arrogant, now subjects of the system they failed to see, and a girl whose smile contains the weight of inevitability. Her comprehension renders the Masters powerless before what is coming. They cannot predict the consequences of their own cruelty because they cannot perceive the architecture of resistance, calm, patient, and meticulous. Awareness has become a weapon they never imagined. For you, the viewer, the lesson is vital. Systems of fear are only as strong as the blind obedience that sustains them. Arrogance blinds, repetition creates predictability, and cruelty leaves patterns. Those who endure and observe gain insight into the weaknesses of absolute authority. Observation becomes inevitability. Memory becomes leverage. And those who understand this dynamic, who internalize the architecture of control, acquire a power that cannot be legislated, crushed, or anticipated by the oppressors themselves. The first act of consequence rarely announces itself with violence. It begins quietly, methodically, like a shadow stretching across the foundations of a building, unnoticed until the structure trembles. For the girl and the network of observant survivors, this act was not physical. It was the transformation of knowledge into strategy. Years of witnessing cruelty, cataloging rituals, and understanding behavior became the blueprint for inevitability. The masters, confident in their absolute authority, could not perceive the storm brewing in silence. Every pattern they had established, every ritual they had perfected, became their undoing. The predictability that had once cemented obedience now served the minds that had endured it. Timing, triggers, weaknesses, all were meticulously remembered, internalized, and poised to be exploited. The girl's subtle smiles, her silent gestures, her unbroken attention to detail, these were the quiet signals that comprehension had arrived. She was no longer merely surviving, she was preparing. Patience, observation, and memory had transformed into latent action. The psychological principle here is clear. Cruelty depends on control, and control depends on perception. The masters believed that terror would maintain obedience indefinitely. But once the minds of the observed understand the architecture of fear, they gain a power the oppressors cannot anticipate. Observation transforms helplessness into inevitability. Knowledge, internalized over time, becomes strategy. The girl's quiet awareness had become a force that would, when unleashed, dismantle the authority of those who had once considered themselves untouchable. And it is in this transformation that the true horror and the true power resides. The photograph, capturing 17 mutilated masters, is not just evidence of physical reckoning. It is the culmination of years of mental preparation, of hidden observation, of subtle defiance. It shows what happens when patience meets inevitability. The oppressor's confidence becomes their vulnerability. Their arrogance blinds them to the invisible currents flowing against them. And those currents, cultivated silently and with precision, carry a force that cannot be resisted. For the viewer, the lesson is unavoidable. Patience, observation, and memory are not passive acts, they are instruments of power. Systems built on fear, repetition, and predictability are always vulnerable to someone who endures, studies, and comprehends. Inevitability is not chaos. It is calculated, precise, and unstoppable once the mind has mapped the weaknesses of authority. The girl's silent preparation teaches that knowledge is the first step toward mastery, and that the fall of the powerful is always written long before it is enacted. The first signs of punishment were subtle, almost ceremonial, yet they carried a weight that no amount of wealth or authority could deflect. The 17 masters, once untouchable, now faced the consequences of their arrogance, ritualized cruelty, and blind confidence. Their mutilation was not instantaneous. It was deliberate, precise, a manifestation of inevitability shaped by years of observation, endurance, and mental preparation. Each sewn eye, each cut tongue was a message, not merely to the perpetrators, but to the world, that no system, no matter how entrenched, can survive the precision of awareness. The psychological impact on the masters was immediate and total. Fear, which they had used as a tool, now turned inward. The arrogance that had blinded them to the network of observation became a liability. They had cultivated predictability, believing that repetition and ritual would maintain compliance. Yet that same predictability, meticulously catalogued by the girl and others who endured, became the instrument of their undoing. Their perception of control shattered in stages, first uncertainty, then panic, then the realization that they had been outmaneuvered by forces they dismissed as powerless. Observation transforms into consequence when patience meets opportunity. The girl's silent study of human behavior, the timing of anger, the rituals of fear, the patterns of predictability, was now manifest. The courtroom photograph immortalizes more than physical punishment. It captures the collapse of authority against a carefully orchestrated inevitability. The girl's smile signals comprehension, a recognition that power is fragile, arrogance is its own trap, and suppressed knowledge, when applied with precision, becomes unstoppable. This is where the lesson deepens. Systems of control, no matter how sophisticated, contain vulnerabilities invisible to those who rely solely on intimidation. Rituals, traditions, and hierarchies are reinforced by repetition, but repetition is predictable. Patterns, once observed and internalized, are exploitable. Memory becomes strategy, observation becomes leverage, and inevitability emerges as a force beyond physical strength. The girl did not wield a weapon, she wielded understanding, the most dangerous tool of all. For the viewer, the implication is profound. Authority and cruelty are only as strong as the ignorance and compliance they depend upon. When observation, endurance, and memory intersect, even the most untouchable figures are vulnerable. The photograph is a blueprint. Cruelty leaves traces, systems leave patterns, and patience transforms comprehension into consequence. Awareness is power. Understanding is inevitability. And those who see the invisible currents of control can never be unarmed again. Her smile is more than expression. It is symbol, signal, and strategy all at once. In the courtroom photograph, it communicates comprehension, endurance, and inevitability. It is the quiet assertion that awareness survives when physical power cannot, that memory persists when suppression dominates, and that observation transforms vulnerability into leverage. She embodies the principle that knowledge, retained and applied, is more potent than any weapon, more unstoppable than any army. Every act of cruelty she witnessed, the sewn eyes, the cut tongues, the ritualized fear, was catalogued and stored. Her mind became a ledger of injustice, a map of predictability, a blueprint for consequence. While the masters assumed dominance, they failed to perceive the latent force they had nurtured unknowingly. Each act of terror had produced the very instrument of their undoing, awareness cultivated in silence, patience, and precision. Her smile is the culmination of that unseen accumulation. Symbolically, the smile represents the fragility of authority built on fear alone. Power that relies on suppression cannot survive comprehension. Systems that manipulate obedience, enforce rituals, and reward silence are vulnerable to anyone who sees, remembers, and interprets the patterns beneath the facade. The girl's awareness is a silent army, her understanding an inexorable force. And in that small, almost imperceptible gesture, she communicates a truth the masters will never grasp. Inevitability is born not from strength, but from knowledge applied with precision. For the oppressed community around her, the smile is a vector for transmitted awareness. Knowledge spreads quietly, through gestures, glances, and unspoken signals, allowing comprehension to ripple beyond the individual. Systems built to contain information cannot contain insight. Memory becomes contagious. Observation becomes a tool of quiet rebellion. And those who endure, who witness, who internalize the architecture of control, gain leverage far beyond what the oppressors imagined possible. For the viewer, the lesson is unflinching. Power is never absolute. Authority depends on perception, obedience, and ignorance. Once awareness emerges, compliance fractures. The smile teaches that patience, observation, and memory are weapons. They operate invisibly, yet they strike with precision. Inevitability is cultivated, not seized. And once understood, the currents of control, manipulation, and oppression can never operate unseen again. You are witnessing a blueprint for seeing through power, for converting observation into strategy, and for transforming survival into mastery. Knowledge, once observed, rarely stays contained. It spreads quietly, invisibly, like an underground current that no authority can dam. Within the network of the oppressed, awareness travels through gestures, coded glances, whispered hints, and subtle acts that evade scrutiny. Each fragment of comprehension builds on another, creating a lattice of understanding too complex for the oppressors to anticipate. The young girl's smile was the epicenter of that network, an unspoken signal that comprehension exists, that observation endures, and that inevitability is approaching. This is how seemingly powerless individuals accumulate influence. Trauma becomes data. Observation becomes intelligence. Memory becomes strategy. The masters, blind in their arrogance, never noticed that each act of cruelty was also an opportunity for learning. each ritual of domination a template for future consequence. Knowledge spreads not by confrontation, but by persistence, by the patient, careful accumulation of patterns that reveal weaknesses invisible to those in power. And as the network of awareness grows, the inevitability of reckoning strengthens, becoming unstoppable once its force is understood. Here lies the crucial principle. Systems built on fear, obedience, and suppression are inherently fragile because they assume ignorance. The moment observation surpasses suppression, the balance of power shifts. Each act of understanding becomes leverage. Each recognition of a pattern, a ritual, a predictable flaw, compounds into a network of inevitability. And those who endure, who internalize these lessons, become participants in a force beyond the comprehension of those who wielded power blindly. For the oppressed, awareness is empowerment. It allows one to predict behaviors, identify weaknesses, and act with precision when the time comes. Knowledge becomes contagious. The young girl's silent comprehension radiates outward, infecting minds, fortifying patience, and cultivating readiness. Inevitability, once imperceptible, gathers momentum. The photograph is not merely a record of punishment, it is a manifesto of understanding, a blueprint showing how observation and memory convert trauma into strategy. For the viewer, this is a moment of transformation. Comment below, twice, the phrase "I see the unseen," not as ritual, but as acknowledgement that observation is the weapon that dismantles illusions of power. By affirming this, you align your mind with the principle hidden in plain sight. Authority depends on ignorance, and insight can never be silenced. Awareness, patience, and memory are now your tools. Inevitability is no longer abstract. It is yours to recognize and wield. Understanding transforms survival into control. The girl and those around her did not act impulsively. They cultivated patience, mental discipline, and precise observation. Every interaction, every reaction from the masters, every subtle shift in behavior was catalogued, analyzed, and memorized. Knowledge became their shield and their weapon. While the oppressors believed they orchestrated every outcome, they were unknowingly feeding the intelligence that would dismantle their dominance. Observation was their invisible arsenal, and time was the crucible that forged it into inevitability. The mechanics of psychological strategy are subtle. Anticipation, pattern recognition, and the quiet manipulation of perception are more powerful than confrontation. The girl understood that by appearing compliant while internally cataloging behaviors, she maintained survival while simultaneously gaining mastery over the system. Fear was temporary, comprehension was permanent. Each act of cruelty left a predictable imprint, an opening. Every ritual, every cadence of punishment, every enforced display of obedience became data points in a blueprint that would ultimately guide consequence. Here is the lesson hidden in history. Those who endure oppression without losing awareness convert trauma into insight. Knowledge gathered quietly, over time, allows one to anticipate actions, manipulate perception, and create inevitability. The master's arrogance blinded them. Their belief in control through fear, repetition, and ritual masked the cracks forming under their own influence. And in those cracks, the patient mind cultivated strategy, an invisible force capable of changing outcomes far beyond what brute strength alone could achieve. The photograph, the frozen moment of 17 mutilated masters and the smiling girl, captures the apex of psychological strategy. The visible consequences are brutal, yes, but the invisible force behind them is far more significant. Years of observation, patience, and comprehension turned into precise execution of inevitability. The oppressors were undone not because of chance, not because of brute force, but because they failed to anticipate the power of the unseen, the quiet, and the patient. For the viewer, the implication is immediate. Mastery comes not from aggression but from perception, memory, and strategic patience. To endure, to observe, to internalize patterns, and to anticipate behavior is to acquire a power that cannot be legislated, suppressed, or resisted. Trauma becomes instruction, awareness becomes leverage, and inevitability becomes the instrument that reshapes authority. The girl's smile is proof. The mind that observes will always outlast the hand that controls. The reckoning begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a current beneath still water, unseen, yet inevitable. The masters, confident in their rituals, blind to the cracks in their authority, could not perceive the forces gathering against them. Every gesture, every routine, every repetition had been catalogued, internalized, and transformed into latent power by the girl and her network. They believed control was absolute, but control depends on perception, and perception had shifted. The first visible signs were small: a hesitation, a falter in ritual, a subtle misalignment in behavior. These were not random mistakes, they were the predictable consequences of arrogance. The master's patterns, repeated endlessly to enforce obedience, had become their undoing. Every predictable trigger, every expected reaction, had been observed, stored, and converted into strategy. Knowledge, accumulated patiently over years of fear and trauma, was now converging into action, invisible yet unstoppable. This is the essence of inevitability. It is not sudden. It is the precise alignment of observation, understanding, and timing. The girl's awareness transformed silent endurance into leverage. Every subtle defiance, every gesture of comprehension, was a node in a network that would dismantle authority. The masters had underestimated patience, memory, and perception, the weapons that operate beneath the surface, unnoticed until they strike. And strike they did, not with chaos, but with precision born of meticulous observation. The photograph immortalizes the result: 17 men, mutilated and powerless, victims of the very patterns they thought secured their dominance. And the girl, whose smile betrays neither anger nor joy, embodies the invisible calculus that made this outcome inevitable. Authority built on fear can suppress bodies, but it cannot suppress minds that observe, remember, and anticipate. Inevitability, when guided by awareness and patience, is absolute. For the viewer, the lesson is profound. Systems of control, no matter how intricate, are never invulnerable. Arrogance creates predictability, and predictability allows the patient observer to convert endurance into consequence. Trauma and observation, when combined with strategy, become unstoppable. Memory becomes leverage, comprehension becomes power, and inevitability becomes a force the oppressors cannot resist. The girl's smile is the signal that understanding is the ultimate weapon, and that the fall of the powerful is always written long before it becomes visible. The collapse of the 17 masters was as much psychological as it was physical. Power, when wielded through fear, carries an illusion of invincibility. The moment that illusion fractures, panic follows. The sewn eyes and cut tongues were more than punishment. They were symbols, physical manifestations of authority stripped bare, revealing how fragile dominance truly is when perception shifts. Fear, once a tool, became their undoing, amplified by realization. They were predictable, vulnerable, and outmaneuvered. Arrogance blinded them to the invisible network of observation. Every ritual they executed, every act of cruelty they enforced, had been internalized by minds they deemed powerless. The girl's silent comprehension, her patient endurance, and her careful observation had converted their patterns into inevitability. Authority depends on perception, but they had surrendered that perception without even noticing. In the psychological architecture of control, the observer often holds the most dangerous power because insight cannot be legislated or suppressed. The master's terror was compounded by the sudden recognition of their own fragility. Systems of oppression rely on compliance, ritual, and repetition. Once those elements are scrutinized, catalogued, and understood, the oppressor's greatest tool, fear, becomes a vulnerability. Predictable reactions, reliance on hierarchy, and repetition create patterns that the patient mind can exploit. The girl, along with others who had endured, understood this principle intuitively. Knowledge of the system is more powerful than brute force, and inevitability grows from comprehension over time. This is the critical truth hidden in history. Those who dominate through fear mistake silence for ignorance. They fail to account for observation, memory, and strategic patience. And when comprehension aligns with opportunity, the outcome is inescapable. The photograph, frozen in time, captures more than punishment. It captures the psychological reckoning of the arrogant, the inevitability of consequence, and the manifestation of awareness into power. For the viewer, the warning is clear. Systems of hidden power are vulnerable to anyone who watches, internalizes patterns, and cultivates patience. Trauma becomes instruction, observation becomes leverage, and understanding becomes inevitability. Those who endure and comprehend gain a force that cannot be resisted, predicted, or legislated against. The fall of the powerful is always written before it is visible, and awareness is the instrument that transforms silent endurance into unstoppable consequence. Institutions are designed to protect authority, yet they are only as strong as the perception they create. Courts, officials, and social hierarchies had reinforced the 17 Masters' dominance for decades, embedding cruelty within ritual, law, and tradition. But these structures are illusions of invulnerability. They depend on obedience, predictability, and the suppression of awareness. The girl and her network of observers exploited this invisible vulnerability, showing that even the most fortified systems crumble when perception shifts. Hierarchies thrive on the assumption that compliance is universal. Rituals, ceremonies, and protocols serve to normalize cruelty, making it appear legitimate and unassailable. The Masters relied on this perception, believing that the institutions surrounding them would insulate them from consequence. But institutions cannot suppress awareness, cannot erase memory, and cannot anticipate patience. The invisible forces, the accumulation of observation, the network of silent comprehension, operated beyond their control, eroding authority from the inside. The collapse of the Masters demonstrates a critical principle. Law and tradition cannot protect arrogance against inevitability. Patterns left by repeated cruelty, rituals enforced for obedience, and predictable behaviors create openings for those who endure and study them. Observation, when applied strategically, bypasses institutional protections entirely. The girl's silent smile, captured in the courtroom photograph, signals not only personal comprehension but an understanding of systemic fragility, proof that authority, no matter how institutionalized, is never absolute. The lesson hidden in plain sight is as uncomfortable as it is powerful. Systems of oppression are only as secure as the ignorance and compliance they enforce. When memory, awareness, and strategic patience intersect, authority becomes brittle. Institutions may punish bodies, enforce rituals, and codify control, but they cannot legislate insight. Knowledge cannot be imprisoned. Observation cannot be silenced. And inevitability, once cultivated in patient minds, renders the strongest hierarchies powerless. For the viewer, this insight is transformative. Every hierarchy, every ritual, every system built on fear and obedience contains cracks visible to the patient and the observant. Understanding these cracks turns endurance into leverage. Awareness transforms oppression into opportunity. And inevitability, cultivated over time, becomes unstoppable. The girl's smile is more than defiance. It is the embodiment of the principle that institutions, rituals, and laws are irrelevant against the strategic mind that perceives the invisible currents beneath the facade of power. Every act of cruelty leaves a pattern. It may appear chaotic to the untrained eye, but repetition, ritual, and predictable behavior create a map for anyone willing to observe closely. The Masters relied on these routines to enforce obedience, believing fear alone would sustain control. But each sewn eye, each cut tongue, each ritualized display of power was recorded in the minds of the observed, catalogued like a ledger of inevitability. The girl, patient and meticulous, had transformed these predictable horrors into instruments of strategy. The brilliance of observation is that it converts repetition into foresight. The oppressors executed cruelty the same way, day after day, expecting submission. But predictable behavior is vulnerability. By internalizing the cadence of punishment, the triggers of anger, and the rhythms of authority, the girl and her network of patient observers built a mental blueprint that mapped weakness, revealed blind spots, and anticipated outcomes. Each repetition of terror became a step in a trajectory that no one but the patient could see unfolding. Here lies the critical psychological truth. Systems that enforce control through predictability create their own undoing. Authority depends on repetition, rituals, and obedience, and all three leave traces for a mind disciplined in observation to exploit. The girl's smile is the signal that comprehension has transformed endurance into inevitability. She had not yet acted violently, but the blueprint of consequence had already formed, invisible, unassailable, and inevitable. Observation itself became a weapon, patience a strategy, and memory a force of reckoning. The lesson extends beyond this singular event. All systems of cruelty, all hierarchies maintained through ritual and fear, carry the same vulnerability. To endure, to catalog, and to internalize the architecture of oppression is to gain power far beyond brute force. The invisible currents of control can be anticipated, predicted, and ultimately exploited by those who understand the rhythms of authority. Awareness turns repetition into leverage, and leverage transforms inevitability into action. For the viewer, this is the principle that changes perception forever. Knowledge is not passive, it is active power. Observing patterns, understanding behavior, and internalizing rituals of control grants access to forces the oppressors never imagined. Trauma becomes instruction. Memory becomes strategy. Observation becomes leverage. And inevitability, once understood, cannot be denied. The girl's smile is not innocence. It is proof that understanding the patterns of cruelty is more dangerous than cruelty itself. Endurance transforms fear into insight. The oppressed do not survive by resisting every act of cruelty. They survive by observing, cataloging, and internalizing it. Each punishment, each ritualized display of power, each predictable act of domination becomes data for those patient enough to endure. Fear, once internalized and studied, becomes a teacher. The girl, whose smile defied expectation, had mastered this principle. She had converted years of terror into comprehension, and comprehension, over time, becomes inevitability. This is the psychology of survival turned into strategy. The mind, even under duress, retains awareness. Patterns emerge from repetition, triggers become predictable, and weaknesses in authority are revealed. The masters, in their arrogance, assumed that fear created compliance. They failed to recognize that fear, catalogued over years of observation, produces the opposite: foresight, patience, and latent power. The girl's silent study of cruelty transformed her from victim to strategist, her endurance into a quiet but unstoppable force. Here is the dangerous truth. Systems of oppression are only as strong as the ignorance they enforce. Every ritual, every predictable act, every attempt to normalize cruelty leaves a blueprint for those who endure. Knowledge gained in silence becomes leverage. Observation becomes strategy. Memory becomes inevitability. The girl had internalized the architecture of fear, not to resist it blindly, but to understand it. And once understood, the patterns of cruelty became instruments she could rely upon to anticipate, navigate, and ultimately dismantle authority. The photograph is proof of this transformation. 17 masters, once confident in absolute control, now lie at the mercy of the inevitability they failed to perceive. And the girl, whose smile communicates comprehension rather than submission, embodies the psychological principle that underpins this reckoning. Patience, endurance, and observation convert trauma into power. Fear does not enslave the mind that watches, it teaches it. Memory does not shatter those who endure, it prepares them. An insight, cultivated quietly over time, is a weapon the powerful cannot anticipate. For the viewer, this is the moment to internalize a principle that resonates far beyond history. Endurance is not submission. Observation is not passivity. Memory is not weakness. Awareness is power, and comprehension becomes inevitability. The systems of control you encounter in life, no matter how rigid or institutionalized, carry the same vulnerabilities. To see them is to arm yourself. To understand them is to survive. To internalize them is to become unstoppable. Observation alone is not enough. Insight must become action. The girl and her network understood that comprehension transforms survival into influence. Every subtle gesture, every calculated glance, every tiny shift in behavior was now a tool to manipulate perception. The masters, blind in their arrogance, continued to operate under the assumption that fear secured obedience. They did not see the threads of strategy forming in silence, the invisible network shaping inevitability beneath their very eyes. The power of psychological influence lies in anticipation. By understanding triggers, timing, and ritualized behavior, the girl could predict reactions before they occurred. The master's reliance on repetition, fear, and ritual created a map for manipulation. Each act of control, meant to enforce compliance, was catalogued and understood. Awareness, once internalized, allows one not only to survive but to shape outcomes, to guide the reactions of oppressors without confrontation, to let inevitability unfold while remaining invisible. Subtlety is the instrument of mastery. The girl did not need to confront the masters directly. Her power lay in the invisible, in the anticipation and strategic orchestration of understanding. Small acts, a glance, a smile, a pause, communicated comprehension, planted doubt, and destabilized perception. Each action built on the patterns of cruelty she had catalogued, transforming them into leverage. Fear, which had once been the oppressor's weapon, became a tool she could exploit without ever lifting a hand. This principle is universal. Systems of control, whether institutional, social, or personal, rely on predictable behavior. They rely on repetition, ritual, and obedience enforced through fear. But every predictable system contains blind spots for those who endure and study it. Knowledge of patterns becomes leverage. Observation becomes influence. Memory becomes strategy. The patient, observant mind converts inevitability into outcome. For the viewer, this is the turning point. Survival is not enough. Observation without application is passive. Insight without strategy is incomplete. To master the currents of control, you must learn to anticipate, to subtly influence, and to convert understanding into consequence. Comment below, twice, the phrase "I see the unseen," not as ritual but as recognition. Insight can shape reality, and awareness can become a force the powerful cannot resist. Fear is a weapon, but only if wielded by the ignorant. The 17 masters had relied on terror to enforce obedience, assuming that suppression and ritualized punishment would secure control indefinitely. But fear is predictable. Its triggers, expressions, and consequences follow patterns that the observant can study, anticipate, and exploit. The girl had mastered this principle. She understood the architecture of terror, cataloging every reaction, every tremor, every lapse in composure. In that understanding, fear itself became a tool she could turn against its creators. The mechanics are subtle but devastating. The masters, accustomed to relying on fear as absolute authority, failed to account for the psychological resilience of observation. They could punish bodies, but they could not penetrate minds that had catalogued their every act. Every predictable reaction, panic, hesitation, overcompensation, became data for the girl, every trigger a potential lever to influence outcome. The very weapon they believed made them untouchable was now their undoing. This is the deeper truth. Those who endure and study fear gain a power the oppressors cannot anticipate. Trauma internalized and analyzed is transformed into insight. Insight, when applied strategically, transforms inevitability into consequence. The photograph captures more than punishment. It captures the reversal of power. 17 men, who had ruled through terror, now faced the inevitable, orchestrated not by brute force, but by comprehension, patience, and silent anticipation. Systems of control, whether built on fear, ritual, or obedience, are fragile because they rely on predictability. Repetition creates patterns. Patterns become maps. And for those patient enough to study them, fear becomes a tool rather than a weapon. The girl's smile embodies this principle, calm, precise, and knowing. It signals mastery over the emotions that once threatened her. Authority can manipulate bodies, but it cannot enslave a mind that understands the architecture of terror. For the viewer, this is transformative. Observe, endure, and internalize fear to convert it into strategy. Understand the triggers, patterns, and rituals that maintain control. Every system of domination contains cracks, and awareness is the chisel that exposes them. Fear is only absolute when unstudied. Once comprehended, it becomes leverage. Memory, observation, and patience transform inevitability into a tool of subtle but unstoppable power. Inevitability becomes visible not in a single act but in a series of precise moments, each building on patient observation. The girl's understanding, honed over years of witnessing cruelty, transformed into action through anticipation and subtle influence. The masters, who believed they controlled every outcome, now faced consequences they could neither predict nor resist. Their authority, meticulously maintained through ritual, fear, and repetition, began to unravel with an almost mathematical precision. The first cracks appeared in hesitation, in faltered gestures, in uncoordinated displays of confidence. They could not perceive the invisible calculus operating against them. Each predictable reaction they exhibited had been catalogued, stored, and converted into strategic leverage by the observers they deemed powerless. The very patterns that had reinforced dominance became the instruments of collapse. Authority, once absolute in appearance, was revealed as fragile, dependent entirely on the illusion of control. Here lies the essential principle. Systems built on fear and compliance are only as strong as their predictability. Every ritual, every punishment, every enforcement of obedience leaves traces. For those who endure and observe, these traces become the roadmap of inevitability. The girl's silent awareness was no longer passive. It was an active force, guiding consequence without confrontation. Observation had become execution. Memory had become strategy. Patience had become inevitability. The photograph is the apex of this realization. 17 mutilated masters, their confidence shattered, their rituals undone, facing the culmination of patterns they themselves created. And the girl, smiling with comprehension, embodies the force that made it possible. The quiet, invisible, and unstoppable logic of understanding. The power of observation had turned against the oppressors. The seemingly invincible system had been dismantled not by strength, but by insight, calculation, and endurance. For the viewer, the lesson is unflinching. The systems of control you encounter, in life or in history, are vulnerable to patience, awareness, and strategy. Authority relies on predictability. Fear relies on ignorance. And inevitability is cultivated by those who endure, who observe, and who understand. Trauma becomes instruction. Observation becomes leverage. Memory becomes power. And comprehension transforms inevitability from abstract concept into unstoppable reality. Cruelty, ritual, and fear are not confined to a single time or place. They are universal tools of hierarchy. Every system of authority, every institution, every social structure that enforces obedience leaves patterns. The 17 masters, brutal as they were merely a microcosm of a universal principle. Power relies on predictability, repetition, and compliance. And wherever patterns exist, they can be observed, catalogued, and eventually leveraged by those who endure and understand. This is the broader truth often overlooked. Hierarchies do not collapse through brute force alone. They collapse when the architecture that maintains them is exposed. Ritualized cruelty, repeated behavior, and reliance on fear create maps visible to patient observers. The girl's silent comprehension demonstrates this principle. Trauma and observation, internalized over time, become instruments of leverage. Authority, once thought absolute, is always contingent upon the ignorance and predictability of those it seeks to control. Patterns of cruelty are, in essence, opportunities. Each predictable act, each repeated ritual, each trigger of fear is a thread in a larger tapestry. Observers, by noting and understanding these threads, gain insight that transforms endurance into strategy, insight into inevitability. The girl's smile in the courtroom photograph is a signal of this mastery. It communicates the subtle but overwhelming truth that understanding patterns of control grants power far beyond what brute strength can achieve. For the observant, this principle extends across generations. Authority in families, organizations, governments, and institutions often relies on repetition and ritual. Those who learn to see the invisible structures, the predictable behaviors, and the weaknesses in perception gain the ability to anticipate, influence, and ultimately master systems that seem untouchable. Knowledge accumulated quietly becomes a tool that can outlast and outmaneuver even the most entrenched power. For the viewer, the implication is both empowering and alarming. The currents of control surround you at every level of society. Observation, endurance, and memory allow you to perceive these currents. Awareness transforms predictability into leverage. Insight converts oppression into strategy. And comprehension turns inevitability into a force that reshapes hierarchies themselves. The girl's smile is no longer just history. It is a blueprint for mastering the hidden architecture of power wherever it exists. Awareness carries a price. To endure, to observe, and to internalize cruelty without breaking is not only a path to power, it is a transformation of the self. The girl, whose smile defied expectation, did not merely survive the horrors of her environment. She became something beyond ordinary comprehension. Trauma, catalogued and analyzed, reshapes perception. Observation, practiced relentlessly, sharpens intuition. Memory, preserved over years of suppression, becomes an arsenal. The cost is subtle, invisible, but profound. The mind that comprehends evil cannot remain untouched by it. This burden is both a weapon and a weight. Insight isolates the observer, separating them from those who do not see, from those who remain ensnared in the illusion of authority. The network of silent comprehension, while powerful, also creates a distance, an unbridgeable understanding that few can share. The girl's smile captures this paradox. It is a signal of mastery, yes, but also a mark of transformation. Those who endure, observe, and comprehend cannot return to ignorance, and in that permanent awareness lies both freedom and responsibility. Psychologically, this is the essence of forbidden knowledge. Once the mind perceives patterns of control, once it understands the mechanisms of fear, cruelty, and ritual, it cannot unsee them. Authority loses its mystique, rituals lose their power, and obedience becomes a visible, manipulable pattern. The girl's comprehension transformed inevitability into her instrument. Yet with every act of insight, the cost of awareness deepens. The world appears simultaneously malleable and perpetually dangerous, filled with currents unseen by the unobservant. This is why mastery is rare. Endurance alone does not suffice. Observation alone does not suffice. Comprehension and patience together create power, but they also irrevocably change the observer. Those who gain the ability to manipulate inevitability inherit a perspective few can bear. The clarity of hidden structures, the foresight of patterns, the knowledge of how power truly operates. The photograph, frozen in time, captures the apex of this transformation. The girl smiling amidst the destruction, having internalized horrors and converted them into strategy. For the viewer, this is a warning and an invitation. To endure and observe is to gain power beyond the reach of brute force, but it comes with a permanent transformation. Knowledge changes perception, sharpens strategy, and cultivates inevitability. Awareness cannot be revised. Trauma becomes instruction. Observation becomes leverage. Comprehension becomes power. And those who truly see the unseen can never return to the world of the blind. Power multiplies when awareness is shared. The girl was not alone in her comprehension. She was part of a quiet, invisible network of observers, each enduring, cataloging, and internalizing the patterns of authority. Knowledge spreads silently, through glances, gestures, whispered hints, and subtle signals that pass beneath the radar of the oblivious. What is learned by one can be transmitted to many, and when understanding becomes collective, inevitability grows exponentially. Observation is no longer individual. It becomes a systemic force. The mechanics of networked awareness are simple, yet devastating. Each observer contributes insight, each memory strengthens anticipation, and each subtle act of comprehension reinforces the overall strategy. Authority relies on predictability, repetition, and ignorance. Once a network exists that understands patterns, predicts behavior, and internalizes rituals, it becomes impervious to conventional enforcement. Fear no longer secures compliance. Terror becomes an instrument of those who endure. The masters, unaware of the quiet accumulation of intelligence around them, are exposed as fragile and fallible. This is the principle of distributed inevitability. Knowledge multiplied becomes unstoppable. The girl's smile, captured in the courtroom photograph, is a signal to the network as much as it is a mark of personal mastery. Observation, memory, and patience converge into a force that operates invisibly, yet decisively. The system of cruelty, maintained through ritual and repetition, cannot withstand the combined comprehension of patient minds. Authority depends on ignorance, and ignorance, once eliminated, leaves only exposure and vulnerability. For the viewer, the lesson is profound. You do not need to confront power directly to dismantle it. By observing, cataloging, and sharing understanding, networks of awareness can neutralize even the most entrenched hierarchies. Trauma, when internalized, becomes insight. Observation, when multiplied, becomes leverage. Memory, when distributed, becomes inevitability. The girl's mastery was not only personal, it was amplified by the invisible network around her, turning endurance into a systemic instrument of transformation. Comment below, twice, the phrase "I see the unseen," not as repetition, but as acknowledgement that networks of observation magnify inevitability. Awareness is contagious. Insight becomes collective, and once comprehended, even the most rigid systems of control cannot survive the quiet, patient, and distributed force of those who endure, observe, and understand. The principles revealed in this story are not confined to a single courtroom, a single photograph, or a single era. Systems of authority, whether feudal, institutional, corporate, or governmental, operate on the same fundamentals: repetition, ritual, fear, and predictable behavior. Every hierarchy carries patterns. Every enforcer of control leaves traces. And every system, no matter how entrenched, contains openings for those patient enough to observe, internalize, and anticipate. The girl's mastery is timeless. It illustrates a universal law of power. Authority relies on compliance, but compliance is always imperfect. Human behavior is patterned, predictable, and subject to repetition. Those who endure, observe, and understand these patterns gain insight invisible to the oppressors themselves. Knowledge becomes leverage, patience becomes strategy, and inevitability becomes the instrument through which hidden currents of power are reshaped. The principles that dismantled 17 masters in 1859 apply equally to boardrooms, bureaucracies, and political systems today. The architecture of control may evolve, but the vulnerabilities remain. Modern power structures are just as dependent on perception as the masters of history were. Fear, obedience, and ritualized authority maintain the illusion of invincibility. Yet observation, patience, and internalized comprehension operate across time and context. Trauma, studied carefully, becomes instruction. Observation, multiplied quietly, becomes influence. Memory, preserved with precision, becomes a strategic asset. And when these forces converge, inevitability manifests, quietly but decisively, revealing the fragility of even the most entrenched authority. For the viewer, the implications are profound. Mastery is not inherited, it is cultivated. To see the unseen, to internalize patterns, and to anticipate behaviors to possess power that transcends brute strength or position. The girl's smile, frozen in history, is a universal symbol of what patience, endurance, and comprehension can accomplish. It is proof that the architecture of control can be understood, exploited, and ultimately mastered, whether in 1859 or today. Awareness transforms everything. Networks of insight amplify individual power. Observation converts fear into leverage. Memory converts repetition into inevitability. And those who comprehend these principles acquire a force that operates invisibly, yet cannot be resisted. The girl's legacy is a blueprint. Authority always carries patterns, systems always carry weakness, and inevitability always favors the observant, the patient, and the strategic. Mastery begins in the mind. To wield the kind of power the girl and her network demonstrated, one must first transform internally. Endurance alone is not enough. Observation without comprehension is hollow. Memory without application is wasted. The mind must become disciplined, patient, and relentlessly attentive. Trauma, fear, and suppression are not obstacles, they are raw materials. Each experience, catalogued and understood, becomes an instrument of insight, shaping perception and sharpening strategy. Psychologically, this is the crucible of transformation. The observer must learn to separate reaction from understanding, emotion from calculation, and chaos from pattern. The oppressor thrives on immediate compliance and predictable fear. The strategist thrives on anticipation, comprehension, and delayed action. Awareness becomes a form of mental armor, memory a weapon of inevitability, and patience the guiding force that converts endurance into mastery. The girl's smile embodies this psychological transformation, a calm, precise, unflinching acknowledgement of hidden currents that ordinary minds cannot perceive. The observer's mind learns to see patterns where others see randomness, to detect weaknesses where others perceive strength, and to anticipate consequences where others experience surprise. This is not instinct. It is trained comprehension. Each act of cruelty catalogued, each ritual remembered, each predictable behavior internalized becomes data. And data, once understood, becomes leverage. Trauma becomes instruction. Observation becomes strategy. Memory becomes inevitability. A mind honed in this way can influence outcomes without confrontation, manipulate perception without detection, and dismantle authority quietly yet decisively. For the viewer, the warning is clear. True power is invisible until mastered. Systems of control can be learned, predicted, and influenced only by those who endure, observe, and comprehend. The psychological burden of awareness is heavy. It isolates, it sharpens, and it transforms. But those who accept it gain access to forces that the unobservant cannot even perceive. Knowledge becomes action, understanding becomes leverage, and insight becomes inevitability. The girl's mastery was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate mental discipline, patient observation, and the strategic application of hidden knowledge. And for anyone willing to follow her example, the same principles apply. Endure, observe, internalize, anticipate. Transform trauma into instruction, Convert insight into strategy, and allow inevitability to become your instrument. The final lesson is stark and uncompromising. Hidden power is always vulnerable to those who endure, observe, and comprehend. The 17 masters believed themselves untouchable, relying on faith, ritual, and repetition to enforce dominance. Yet each act of cruelty, each predictable gesture, each repeated ritual became a blueprint for their undoing. The girls' quiet observation, patience, and comprehension transformed inevitability into action. Authority, no matter how entrenched, crumbles when perception shifts. This is the ultimate truth of forbidden knowledge. Power is contingent, not absolute. Systems, hierarchies, and institutions operate on patterns. Those patterns, once internalized and understood, provide the keys to influence, leverage, and mastery. Trauma becomes instruction. Observation becomes strategy. Memory becomes leverage. And awareness, cultivated patiently, becomes the instrument through which inevitability manifests. The photograph captures this principle perfectly. The girl smiling amidst destruction, silent but knowing, holding within her comprehension the architecture of control itself. For those who witness, this is both warning and blueprint. You cannot undo knowledge once seen, but you can harness it. You cannot unsee patterns of cruelty, predictability, or authority, but you can learn to manipulate them. Endurance without observation is survival. Observation without strategy is wasted. Comprehension without patience is incomplete. Only by integrating all three does one achieve mastery, the ability to anticipate, influence, and ultimately reshape systems that seem invulnerable. The girl's transformation mirrors the potential within every mind willing to endure and comprehend. Awareness is permanent, understanding is power, inevitability is an instrument. Those who truly see the hidden currents of control gain access to forces that operate beyond brute strength, beyond law, beyond fate. They become untouchable not because of dominance, but because they perceive patterns others cannot, act with precision others cannot anticipate, and wield insight that cannot be legislated or suppressed. For the viewer, the call is clear: endure, observe, internalize, transform trauma into insight, convert observation into strategy, and embrace awareness as both weapon and shield. Comment below, twice, the phrase "I see the unseen" to acknowledge your alignment with this principle. The currents of control surround you at every level of life. The opportunity to perceive them, to master them, and to convert inevitability into your instrument is now yours. The girl's smile is no longer history. It is a lesson, a blueprint, and a challenge. Once you see the unseen, you can never return to ignorance, and power, subtle and unstoppable, becomes yours.